What's up, girls? Hey, everyone. Welcome to our new series, which I'm only realizing as I raise my arms we have not yet named as of this recording.
We tend to do that. We tend to start recording and not name.
Welcome to, what should we call this, Erin?
Asked and answered?
Asked and answered.
Yeah.
That's so hostile. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our new 6-week advice column series with my dear friend Erin Lowry, aka Broke Millennial. We're calling it Asked and Answered because that's what it is. You ask, we answer. Period.
No hostility.
No hostility. But listen, we're here to what are we here to do?
To ease you during these troubled times, but also be straight with you and give you direct information that you need.
We're here to be efficient. Asked and answered.
There will be no lollygagging.
No. We suffer no fools. Leave no quarter.
Zero tangents. Titanic will not be referenced one time.
It will be referenced multiple times in every episode. And I am very happy to share that this series is brought to you by our very good friends over at advisor.com. If you're not familiar, advisor.com is the financial advising service that we work with and endorse here at TFD. As some of you might know, I have been working with a financial advisor now for several years. It has really changed both my financial life and, to be honest, at some level, my mental health, especially since the election, because I feel like I can outsource a little bit of my anxiety as it pertains to my money decisions, something that we're going to talk about a lot on this show. But more generally speaking, working with a financial advisor, if it's something you've been considering, we really support advisor.com because they operate on a flat fee model, which means that, they work for their clients and not commissions. And there's a level of transparency in how they operate that we really endorse. We also just know their team very well and love working with them. If you use the link in our description, you can set up a free call with one of their advisors. Just talk to them, kind of see how the whole process works, ask any questions you might have. And plus, being a member of the TFD community, you get an exclusive $500 discount on your first year of working with them. We love them. We very highly endorse them and just working with an advisor generally, but we love their model. So give them a look at the link in our description. And let's get into the show. So Erin Lowry, aka Broke Millennial, is my guest for this. But I want to first and foremost say that it's been a long time since you've been broke.
Yes, that is true.
So now you're, what would you say, affluent millennial?
Comfortable by New York City standards, affluent by rest of the country standards.
So for those who don't know, this is Erin, dear friend of mine, I would say neighbor.
Yeah.
We live about 20 blocks from each other, which is like borderline by New York City standards, but also a personal finance icon. Tell those who may not know a little bit about you.
My elevator pitch is bad, but I started back in 2013 with the blog. They were still relevant then, Broke Millennial. And it really was chronicling a combination of my journey towards learning more about finances, particularly later on investing. But I always loved talking about money. But I did not like math. I was not a business major. I did not work on Wall Street. I was a theater and journalism major who had worked a string of kind of starving artist, I hate that term, adjacent jobs in order to just make things work in New York City. And I just figured out how to cobble life together. But I really was noticing how many of my friends, even those on what I would maybe gently call parental welfare and getting a lot of support from their parents, were just still so stressed about money. And I wanted to know why. So I started asking a lot of questions and then sharing stories about how my parents taught me about money, how I was learning about money and continuing my education. But I consider myself a financial translator. I talk to experienced people, and then I distill and demystify financial jargon to make it relatable. For the average, I'm going to say millennial, but Gen Z are more than welcome.
Love it. Also the author of 3 barn burner personal finance books, which do exactly what you say, ask experts and sort of break it all down. So for this series, which we're doing, as you saw, in partnership with our beloved advisor.com, we are acting as our own advisors of sorts, although need to be clear, neither of us are certified. So if you want an actual certified financial planner, you're going to have to talk to someone at the link in our description here. But we do have, I think, a fair amount of knowledge, street smarts,
and experience.
And so we are bringing you 6 episodes, each around different topics. You guys sent us, I would say, hundreds of questions, ranging from what's going on politically to relationships, debt, credit, retirement, everything you can imagine. We're going to have 6 episodes, all kind of loosely on a theme, although there's a lot of overlap. And given that reading the news is feeling more and more like an extreme sport, we thought we'd start with politics.
Yay.
How are you holding up? What's your news consumption strategy?
Tempered at this point. I feel like their goal is to shock and awe. Mm-hmm. So I heard advice recently that was to pick 2 things that you really care about in this climate and really focus on being very aware of what's going on there, aware of how you can support those causes, and then not to necessarily completely dismiss everything else, but to maybe just not fixate on over-consuming all the information all the time, because it's just going to be too overwhelming and I think lead to analysis paralysis.
I would agree with that. I was listening to Ezra Klein for a while, which I recently had to stop because he is on some level like listening to a 12-year-old who still believes in Santa Claus. Like all of his takes sort of have an underlying assumption that Republicans still act in good faith and or are bound by the sort of norms of politics, or that, Trump will be hemmed in by negative consequences of his actions. And basically all of his guests just are like, no, none of this is real anymore, buddy. He doesn't care. He's just doing what he wants. So I'm looking for my new morning listen.
I'd love to see where you land. I like anything also that's a quick 10 to 15 minute, here's the headlines kind of conversation too right now. Because I just like to be abreast. And then also listening local. Yes. Being very active, I would say more on a local level right now feels more accessible and like it will be more of a direct impact, particularly if you live in a state where you're trying to protect what your state constitution says and make sure that anything nationally that might change stays protected in your state.
That's a good piece of advice. I will say on the digestible front, I have listened to the Financial Times news briefing every morning for basically ever. And I actually find that it's sort of reassuring in an almost nihilistic way, because it really does illustrate how completely indifferent financial markets are to politics, which we're going to discuss. The headlines on the FT news briefing will be 100,000 people died in a mudslide and name a country. Markets climbed by 2%.
Well, also, let's just say up top, the stock market is not the economy. It is not the same.
No.
I think that is always important to keep reiterating.
Oh, yes. And we will address that. But I do think coming up with a news strategy that leaves you feeling informed, but as you say, not unable to, effectively analyze is very important. And in some ways, again, concentrating on financial markets, at least for part of it, is a good reminder that above all, we live in a system that is driven by global capital and by corporate power. And, politics is but a game to them.
Yep. I also, on the news front, Ingestion, if you have friends that you trust and especially who are news junkies, you could ask them for recommendations if you just feel overwhelmed, or if you feel like, oh, this thing has come up, I don't know where to turn in terms of learning more about it. Ask your news junkie friends. I think that they do a good job too of distilling, or just say, here's a podcast episode, or here's a great article, or here just distills it quickly in a relatable way.
They're I don't know, Marie Curie getting the really heavy doses of radiation to for the betterment of the people around her. Just taking it all unfiltered. Some people like
that,
I don't know. I don't think they like it. I think that they're addicted to it, but at this point, who could enjoy consuming that much news?
I don't know. It's exhausting.
And as you know, if you're watching the channel, I've been doing my little iPhone dispatches. By the time this airs, I might have done another one. But either way, we've been talking in a more sort of candid form lately, because at this point, it feels like if you record something even a day before it airs, everything's different. So the question you guys asked, we tried to pick ones related to our political situation that are a little more evergreen. So let's jump in with our first question. How do I convince my understandably capitalism-wary friends to invest in themselves with the tools that we currently have? It's so hard to watch them financially struggle while understanding why these things give them the ick.
You're not going to change anybody's mind, probably. You need to also know what works for your friends. I fear a lot of times that people go scare tactics on something like this and will say, well, if you don't, then you're never going to have enough money and you're just going to have to work forever and you're going to be living off of, absolutely nothing by the end of your life and you'll never be able to retire. Like they just laundry list stuff like that, which could be true. The bigger thing to consider is what makes you feel comfortable, what makes you feel safe within your political beliefs and how you want to interact with money, and understand the difference between saving and investing. That to me is a huge part of this conversation. That saving is great. Investing does so much more to grow your wealth. And if you do not want to invest at all, but you have a really big financial goal, let's say like throwing out there $1 million is the goal, saving your way to $1 million compared to investing your way to $1 million, that's decades compared to maybe 1 decade, depending on how much and how well the market is doing. So it is really important to understand that when you invest, the stock market does some of the heavy lifting for you. You probably are seeing on average over the years, maybe 7 to 8% return. When you're saving, right now, savings accounts are getting a generous, perhaps 3.5 to 4%. That could go down to 0.5%. So oftentimes savings accounts are barely keeping up with inflation. So your money technically could be losing purchasing power sitting in a savings account. And you're going to have to save so much more money to achieve the same goal compared to investing.
Also, $1 million, we just got to always touch on this. Sounds like a lot.
It's not.
It is literally just like what you need for a pretty normal middle class retirement for like 2 people in a household if you want to retire anywhere near normal retirement age.
The way I like to compare $1 million is that when did the first Survivor show come out? I think like 2000. It was $1 million prize pot in 2000. And that sounded like so much money. It is still $1 million prize pot, which it should absolutely be adjusted for inflation and much closer to at least $2 million at this point. But we have allowed this to be a benchmark for quote unquote a lot of money for decades of at least our lives. Yes. And then decades preceding. Becoming a millionaire was a huge deal for many, many decades at this point. I like to use the number because it's accessible and relatable and still is a lot of money to a lot of people, but also understanding that if that is your retirement number, you're probably living off of maybe $40,000 a year to comfortably make that stretch, which, given the cost of life right now and then definitely in decades to come, seems like probably not a super comfortable life.
100%. I also I have a video where I go off about this at greater length, which I'll link to. I'm not going to repeat myself, but I just will say this. Keeping yourself broke and keeping yourself in a cycle of struggling voluntarily, because if you're in a position where you could be investing in the market, but capitalism gives you the ick, so you're not, you are one of the few people in this country who has the option to build wealth and is actually choosing not to. Choosing not to not only does nothing to help you, it almost certainly does nothing to meaningfully help any of the causes you care about, because it leaves you fundamentally much less able to contribute to those causes, whether through money or for time, to be able to dedicate yourself more fully and actively to it. Like, you're basically essentially guaranteeing yourself that you will be stuck in a cycle of having to work, having to live paycheck to paycheck, and or rely on very meager savings, which to your point could easily be wiped out by inflation and cost of living. And I think that people often underestimate just how much of the system being bad is dependent on so many people being so day-to-day struggling that they're unable to focus on anything more meaningful. I mean, again, when we look at the numbers, 90 million people didn't vote who could have. Some of those people, sure, are completely disconnected for personal reasons, but a lot of those people couldn't get time off work, couldn't get to their polling station, were not able to be informed on what was happening politically, who the candidates were, who they wanted to vote for, are just completely left out of the political process by the fact that they have no time to think about it or no bandwidth to think about it. And that is a huge part of what keeps us in this problem. So intentionally keeping yourself on a hamster wheel of financial struggle does nothing to benefit you, obviously, but I also think does nothing to benefit anything you care about.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. Okay. What is your opinion on saving hard/physical cash rather than having a checking account?
I hate to bring it to this, but look at the LA wildfires. Mm-hmm. We are living in a time where climate change is changing the scope of our natural disasters so quickly that hurricanes are changing, where the Asheville, North Carolina being a great example. You think that that's an area that's not necessarily going to be hit. So whether it's tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, mudslides, there are so many ways for your home to get quickly destroyed. So that is one of the extreme reasons why you need to be very careful if you're going to save cash in your house. Even those fire safety boxes have been proven not to hold up to the kind of temperatures that you're going to see and experience in a big fire like that. So that's one reason to use a bank. I understand the fear. We can get into the FDIC coverage in a little bit, but being subject to getting robbed is another reason. And then also, if something happens to you and people don't know that you have cash saved in your house, it can get quite literally thrown out or donated, or something can happen. The number of stories that I have heard about, we just happened to open a piece of luggage and oh my gosh, my grandma had stashed, $5,000 in this luggage that we were just going to toss. A friend of mine's grandfather literally hid cash in the lining of his Lazy Boy couch. And luckily somebody thought to look there because they knew that he had a tendency to squirrel away cash. But it is really important, one, if you're going to do it, I would have it be a modest amount, like an amount that is like a grab and go safety thing for you, that if you need to evacuate where you live and you want to have cash on hand, you have it. But to completely disregard banks and have potentially tens of thousands of dollars around your house really put both you and your money at risk.
I'm going to go ahead and blame disaster/zombie shows and their immense popularity for the sort of doomsday orientation that a lot of people take when it comes to like how they prepare themselves and orient themselves. I just want to stress this. If we're in a scenario where banks are worthless and your money is no longer accessible, I don't actually think cash is going to serve you.
You need gold bars.
You need a baseball bat covered with nails. You know what I mean? Like,
also you need medication. You need, there's water, other resources.
Because think about this logically. We're in a scenario where banks are worthless. This person who's taking your cash, what is the value of that cash now? The economy has completely crumbled by this metric. So what are they doing with that cash? It's just paper at this point. I think it kind of reminds me of like that scene in Titanic when I think it's Cal is like trying to get on the lifeboat, so he like hands a big wad of bills to the crew member who's like obviously gonna die in an hour, and he's like, I don't want your money, it can't save me any more than it can save you, or whatever. That's the scenario we're talking about. You know what I mean?
However, I do want to acknowledge that yes, if we're in a full apocalyptic landscape, who cares? Save yourself in another way. But I do want to recognize that it's scary to have seen more bank failures be happening over the last handful of years, especially big public ones like the Silicon Valley Bank. And you see things like that happening. So I just want to reiterate, FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, currently, as of this recording, covers $250,000, up to $250,000 of your deposits. This is not coverage on investments. This is specifically on money market accounts, savings accounts, checking accounts, all of the things that are cash equivalents. Now, if that bank were to fail, like Silicon Valley Bank did, the FDIC will step in and reimburse people up to $250,000. If you are exceeding $250,000 at a bank, you might want to diversify your bank so that you continue to get coverage. That's one thing that's really important in terms of risk mitigation on that front. There has been some conversation in the news about maybe the FDIC getting dissolved, absorbed into the Treasury. We just have to pay attention and watch how that plays out. If the federal government no longer backs the deposits at our banks, then we do need to some degree reevaluate some of these conversations. And unfortunately, to kind of go back to the capitalism ick question, the really, really big banks would probably be the better answer in the sense of they have more bandwidth to cover losses compared to the credit unions and smaller regional banks. Technically, FDIC insurance does not cover credit unions. They have their own, but is also backed by the federal government. And I'm going to possibly flub the acronym, but I think it's NUCA or something like that. So Just know that unfortunately, regional banks and credit unions would probably be hit a little bit harder in the case and become slightly riskier in the case of FDIC insurance going away.
Our next question was actually, is the FDIC going to be dissolved? Which we'll just sort of fold into what we're talking about because we're already there. But I'm going to take it back to listening to the Financial Times news briefing every morning. One thing that doing that has done, aside from rot my brain completely with capitalist brain worms, it's very much giving like the guys in the smoking room. I'm going to reference Titanic again, the guys in the smoking room.
Did you watch it recently?
I'm never not watching it. No, but the guys in the smoking room and after dinner where they go to just like laugh at, the paupers or whatever. And like, this is all a complete joke to them. That's what it gives a little bit. But again, I do think there is something that is sort of coldly reassuring in it in just the context of the Trump administration in particular and all of these scary things that we're hearing. Because as we've discussed on the channel before, long-term financial planning and wealth building is all about playing the odds, right? You are never going to be able to make a foolproof choice, but probability would dictate that the FDIC will not be dissolved and or we're not going to enter a state in which our money is completely unprotected. And I say that because, the actual process of doing that would be a lot more complicated than an executive order. And I actually don't think that there's nearly enough support in Congress for anything like that to happen. It's going to get backed up in the courts. Also, I really do think, and maybe this is cope, but I do think we're headed for a congressional bloodbath come 2026. And I think a lot of Congress people are aware of that on the right. So, and also this is like a historically incredibly, incredibly thin margin. So this kind of revolutionary restructuring of government at these more sort of legislative levels would already be damn near impossible to get through, but especially in a scenario where they have a razor thin margin and a lot of these seats are up for grabs and people are very, very angry. It just doesn't feel likely on a completely political level. But taking a step even further back in terms of the panic of it all, when you listen to something like the FT news briefing, you really understand the extent to which, and we saw this with the tariffs, which we're about to get to as well. Anytime the market takes a big shudder at things, I mean, I'm not going to say it's like deep state level where like someone's like coming into the Oval Office and being like, what did we say? You can't do anything that messes with global capital. But when something legislatively or politically starts to really F with rich people and really, really F with global finance and financial institutions, there is definitely, I think, a level of just sort of almost systemic protection in a way that there isn't. Like, name any program that really benefits the poor or veterans or disabled people or whatever the case may be. Those are all probably on the chopping block because they're not, in fact, it's probably good for financial markets if those people are suffering more and more disenfranchised. When you're talking about completely kneecapping all of the many wealthy people in this country who have hundreds of thousands of dollars of liquid assets, which is many of them, and making them completely unprotected, you're going to run into some very, very serious pushback in a way that actually hurts. So from again, playing the odds scenario, I wouldn't worry about it.
Also, a majority of banks wouldn't want it to be happening either. So that's the other thing is the lobbying power that are the financial institutions. By and large, they don't want to have to self-insure those funds if the federal government can be insuring them because it would change their risk profile and tolerance. So that is another thing to consider. But it is, in my opinion, also just coming back to it's reassuring that it is a very long road. This is not an executive order one. And even if the FDIC were to be absorbed into the Treasury in a very specific way, we probably still would have some level of protection. If the protection was lowered or something like that, then again, diversify your banks even more. Just make sure that your money is protected to the extent that it can be and stay abreast of this stuff. That's the other one for me, especially on the FDIC topic. This matters so much. And so many people are not even aware of what FDIC insurance is and what the coverage is. And even if what you have in the bank is $500, $5,000, $50,000, it's not coming anywhere near that $250,000 limit. If that's your life savings, you still want it protected. So just making sure particularly if you see startups or any sort of bank that's trying to get your money, trying to give you a really good deal, make sure they have FDIC coverage before you switch banks or go with any sort of money management startup.
I totally agree. And as a last note on that, I will say the other thing with, to your point about banks not wanting this because it would greatly push the risk back onto them and also then make them compete on the front of who can most effectively insure their customers, which is something they don't want. This is why when we talked in the video I did, the first video I did about the political stuff, is that we need to be a lot more lucid that a lot of the unraveling of many of our protections as consumers and as sort of, anyone besides the 1% in America is not unique to Trump, did not start with Trump, certainly didn't even start with Biden. When we look at the bailout of Wall Street, that's Obama. That was under Obama that Wall Street was bailed out. And when we look at how that played out, it was very clearly after the 2008 crash, it was very clearly an instance of the government and by extension taxpayers absorbing all of the sort of not just the risk, but let's just say the negative blowback of these incredibly risky, predatory, bad decision-making on the part of these big banks, which didn't establish, but definitely cemented and even further reinforced a dynamic in which why would the banks ever want a situation where they're having to pay for their mistakes and not the U.S. taxpayer? They're going to do everything in their power to keep that dynamic going. Mm-hmm. So not only are you right on that front, it's also, I think this is also part of staying grounded, is understanding that these dynamics that have been put in place where the banks are essentially favored over the American population, that didn't start with Trump. This isn't new.
No, it's not. He is eroding things in a very different way. Like
totally.
the small amount of guardrails that were put in place post 2008, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB being one, it's going to get completely defanged. It pretty much already has been, but they are a government entity that was trying to do its best to put more protections into place for your average consumer. And the head is often fired, even though that's a whole Supreme Court case, but the head of the CFPB often gets replaced with a new administration. That's not new, but they have basically been given a stop work order at the moment. So there is no movement going forward on any sort of protections, including things like capping overdraft fees, making sure that, banks cannot engage in harmful practices that are predatory but technically legal. Capping how much people can charge in interest so that it's not in kind of predatory loan shark area. So
overdraft
it's just,
fees.
Yeah. So that is the thing that is to keep in mind. There are other ways that our protections are being eroded, and you need to be aware of what that looks like, because you might have had a protection 6 months ago on overdraft fees at your bank that's about to get rolled back and changed, particularly if your bank had kind of adhered to the maximum we're going to charge is $8. And now if they have the unfettered access to charge as much as they want, it could be $45 a transaction, could go up to $100 a transaction. Like, who knows?
Jamie Dimon, you will pay for your crimes. Okay. Will tariffs be good for the U.S. economy?
No.
Okay, thank you. I was like, what is all this suspense?
No, it's exhausting because the argument can be well made in the sense of trying to be like, so we're just trying to bring jobs back. We're trying to even out what the cost of something would be. The amount of years it would take for that to play out, but also for the cost of things to come down overall in order for manufacturing within our country to be able to compete with importing these goods from being manufactured elsewhere, it's not going to be helpful for the average consumer.
Nor for the average small business owner. Also, this is just a small note, but most of these industries are not coming back. They're not coming back. You can't use tariffs to make it so all of a sudden we're going to be producing all the steel and lumber and everything again. These things aren't that ship sailed 40, 50 years ago. It's just not going to happen. So I do think unfortunately, I was listening to Scott Galloway this morning, which listen, I controversially love Scott Galloway. I was listening to him earlier talking about the effects of so many of these policies and how, generally speaking, the people who statistically are most likely to have voted for Trump, to vote right generally, to be extremely hostile towards the government sort of as a concept, to be, very in favor of cutting a lot of these programs, of imposing these very onerous tariffs. All of these things are also statistically the most likely people to be drastically negatively affected by them, whether it's social programs or the cost of living being very minute to minute. And I do think that that is also important to remember when we look at this, is that unfortunately, and I actually very much politically don't like or agree with the perspective of like laughing at people effing around and finding out with their vote, because I think that what leads people to be in a cycle of decimated education, poverty, limited social resources, all of these things, what leads people down a pipeline of eventually voting very strongly against their own interests and wanting to see things that benefit them be destroyed is very complicated and can't just be hand waved away with these people are all stupid and worthless. And also, I think politically, eventually we're going to have to win the working class back, right? Like we're going to have to invest in these programs through political means. So I don't particularly take schadenfreude in seeing, a single mom who voted for Trump lose her SNAP benefits. Nor do I think that politically that's where we should be directing our energy as people who support these programs. That being said, I do think for a lot of these egregiously bad economic policies, unfortunately, we will probably have to just find out. And people won't change on some of these fronts until things get significantly worse for themselves personally. And unfortunately, tariffs are likely to be one of those things that really negatively affects a lot of people in a pretty tangible way. Now, whether or not people will then make the connection that tariffs have negatively affected them and it was indeed Donald Trump who pushed that in the first place remains to be seen. I'm unconvinced that some of these Trump loyalists will ever think anything bad happening ever is his fault.
No. Well, I'm sure they also have a scapegoat already planned out for
At
who
some
they
point,
would pivot to blame when the tariffs make life very difficult for large groups of people in our country. The other thing, too, is this notion that tariffs are in exchange for somehow magically no longer having to pay income tax is part of the argument I find very frustrating. The odds of that ever working out are completely slim to none, like infinitesimally likely.
On the front of someone else getting blamed, the one thing that's really keeping me going right now is just knowing that at some point, Elon Musk's going to get thrown into that PR meat grinder and be blamed for everything. And it's going to be a fallout of epic proportions. And I just will rejoice that day. I will be swag surfing around my apartment, just really enjoying seeing that. Can't wait. Can't wait. Also, what's happening to Elon Musk's face? Is that just all the ketamine use?
Well, I think just unfettered access to power is rotting him from the inside.
He's looking crazy. That video of him in the Oval Office, did you see that?
No.
He's standing next to Trump just sweating bullets while Trump's just like sitting slumped over at the table. He's just like rambling on really sweaty about what Doge is doing for like 30 straight minutes, like grinding his teeth. Everyone, just for context, everyone who has any close access to Elon Musk is very open about, he's been open about the fact that he uses ketamine, which is like a very psychoactive drug that can be used both therapeutically and recreationally. Clearly we're erring toward the latter here, but everyone says he's like massively addicted to it and like whacked on it all the time. But in this video in particular, which
is really what we want for people in control of large chunks of our political government right now.
Okay, I've been thinking about adjusting my asset allocation post-election. For context, this is the assets you have both in terms of investments. It could also be real estate, what you keep in liquid cash, et cetera. I feel like the bond market's going to take a beating. Crypto is on the rise again. Interest rates are going to keep softening, and I want to shore up more cash than usual. I'm someone who likes to have a lot of control over these things, but I also know that any rash decisions could backfire. What are you doing to hedge your bets in this time without losing out on long-term gains?
I'm actually not changing too much. I am shoring up a little bit of cash reserves compared to what I normally would do, which I also did around the pandemic. Anytime things feel really unstable, I guess is the word I would use, I personally like to have just a bit more cash in my emergency fund. especially because I am self-employed, so my income can be volatile as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at least 6 months, I think, is good advice of cash. Of when I say 6 months, bare minimum coverage of everything you need month to month. So housing, transportation, child or pet care, any sort of dependence, paying your debts, and then minimums in this particular case. And then, health insurance, anything like that, bare essential living is what we're talking about with this number. For some people, 3 months. I would say if you're feeling a little wary, 6 months is good. If you have volatile income, maybe 9 months to a year, depending on what feels good to you. But outside of that, I'm really not changing very much. I tend to be a fairly aggressive investor when it comes to my asset allocation. So what that means is my portfolio very much is dominantly stocks, just a little bit of bonds, a little bit of more conservative investments. So that's where I personally am. Your risk tolerance matters, but also so does your time horizon, which just means the amount of time until you need that money. So if you are somebody who is in your early 30s and you are not planning to retire in the next 10 years, you're thinking more of a traditional retirement age of in your 60s, you do not want to get too conservative too early, because that is really going to impede your long-term wealth earning potential. So you want to make sure to be very careful about doing anything like that or being too speculative with your investments like cryptocurrency. I would say crypto should only be fun money amount of investments still. I still do not consider that a proven asset class.
And I consider it to be an ethical abomination. So I say zero in crypto. And the fact that a huge amount of, the fact that Trump's victory was such a huge victory for crypto as an asset class, all the more reason, in my opinion, to send it back to hell where it was forged. This is not a plug. I'm not instructed to say this. I just want to say, part of the reason I work with a financial advisor and have for years is because as you address actually in your investing book, it is very difficult psychologically, I think, unless you have, a force of willpower, the likes of which, this country has rarely seen in Erin Lowry. It is really difficult to not freak the hell out and make bad decisions. And I definitely am one of those people who has a tendency to err toward the panicky. And so for me, I think, I personally like to be able to sit down with my advisor and just be like, what's the vibe, guy? And get a very, very sort of neutral, detached, disaffected read on the situation. But if you are navigating this by yourself, I really echo your thoughts of a little bit more cash maybe, which is also something we're doing. But otherwise, just try to tune out the noise. And I always say this, we have 150 plus years of market data. That covers 2 world wars, that covers the Great Depression, that covers Vietnam, the Cold War, 2008 crash, 9/11. Name a historical event, we have data on it. Overall, it still remains remarkably solid and reliable once you look at a long enough period of time. And that's, generally speaking, if you're investing the period of time we're talking about.
And I'm a bit of a history nerd, so take this with a grain of salt. I find it reassuring to go back and look at stock market history. I did that in my investing book. There's a chapter about what to do if you're feeling panicky, which is, here's how the market tends to work. It is cyclical. There are ups and downs. It's the part of the cycle. But we are likely not going to be in an event that is worse than World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. Might be equal to, but probably not going to be worse than. And the market did recover from all of those events as well. And the people who made out really well in more recent situations like 2008 are the people who did not panic, who left the money in and also kept contributing. That's actually where a lot of wealth building potential lies, is to not panic and to just keep steady. One of my favorite stories from interviewing an investing advisor who worked at a very, very well-known brokerage, very famous brokerage. And now she would be in probably her late 50s. And she said when 2008 happened, she was obviously advising people, just kind of keeping status quo for most folks. But for herself, she knew that even though she was very rational, had all of this information, it was going to make her panic to look at her own portfolio. So for a full year, she never opened a statement. All she did was keep auto contributions on, kept putting money into the market, but never actually looked because she knew it would make her feel panicky and maybe change her mind and react to the market. And that proved to be a pretty big windfall for her because she kept investing when the stock market went down during that period of time. So then when it came back up, she got a really good return. So if you're somebody who maybe you're not ready to work with a financial advisor for whatever reason, even though it tends to be a lot more cost effective than you think, then just don't look for a period of time, but don't turn off your auto contributions. Keep contributing to that 401k. If you're doing it in another way, keep contributing. Maybe just avoid looking at the numbers for right now. Although right now things are going pretty well.
All right, guys, listen, these are tough times. We're not here to gaslight you, but we are here to say that financial markets don't care who's president, generally speaking. And we need to separate out our political convictions and strengthen them from financial panicking, which never serves anyone and will only leave you in a worse position and likely less able to do anything constructive about the actual political crisis that we find ourselves in. That was the first episode of Asked and Answered, brought to you by advisor.com. Erin, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Where can we find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Broke Millennial Blog or Substack at Broke Millennial as well.
Though she rarely posts on IG, I must say.
I'm making a comeback soon.
A scarce figure.
Yeah.
Thin on the ground, Erin Lowry posts these days.
Or just email me. Go to my website and email me.
Knock on her door.
Contact.
She lives in New York. Come
Yeah.
knock on her door. All right, guys. See you next week. Bye.